And would you start us with the prayer this morning?
Most righteous Father, thank you for blessing us with another day of life. We're grateful that we can assemble together today. Thank you for this Lord's Day and opportunities we have to study your word together. We get so much out of your word as we study it on our own, but we value each other's input and feedback for challenges us to think through the things we studied and learned. Help us, Father, to be pure and holy and righteous before you, to adapt ourselves in any way we need to be more pleasing in your sight. We love you. We thank you for your mercy. Thank you for sending Jesus that he might serve as a perfect sacrifice for our sins. We pray these things in his name.
So our memory verse, 2 Samuel 7, verse 16, come forward. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So we begin this morning. I want to go back to last week for just a second. 1 Samuel 1 through 17. Does anybody have any comments about that we weren't able to talk about last week? Anything from the text of 1 Samuel 1 through 17? So we move into chapter 18 then. This week we're in chapter 18 through 31 and 2 Samuel 1. Where are we at this point in history? What's going on here in Israel? What events are we reading about?
The kind of the transition from the judges into their first king, and then how the first king really fulfills everything that Samuel told them was going to happen. First king, really kind of you think about it, there wasn't. We think about a king and palaces and things like that. Early on, there wasn't that. Saul was crowned king, and then went back and was working in the fields. So it's just odd the way that so this really is transition into a true monarchy.
Yeah. So we're very much in a transition period in Israel. Chapter 7, yeah.
I was just characterized by oppression from certain nations have been completely pushed out of the land. So the Philistines seem to be a recurring component of the Israelites.
And the Philistines are going to continue to come up for a long time. We're going to read even today, there were some places we think about, like Ziklag, for example, where David gets land in the later chapters of 1 Samuel. That was land that was promised to the tribe of Simeon and Judah back in Joshua, and they never completed the conquest. And it's still given to the people, but it's in the land in the control of the Philistines at the time. So they're going to be just continual opponents of Israel for a while, because Israel never really finishes their job. Chapter 17, what was happening in chapter 17 as we get to the transition to our discussion today? 1 Samuel 17. David and Goliath. So we see David's we talk about this as one of the big monumental moments in the history of David, right? This is kind of his first we're introduced to him as a warrior here. We see he brings up his past. He's killed lions and bears, he's done this great thing protecting the sheep, and now he goes out and he's killing the Philistines. And we see Matthew, it may have been you last week, we were talking about the attitude of Saul and the Israelites, and some of what led to their downfalls already on display here in 17. And David's attitude is just completely different. So we spoke about the fear of the people. They're Saul's demonstrating fear. They're not willing to go battle the Philistines here. They don't want to fight Goliath. And David, what's significant about David being the one to stand up and say, hey, yes, we can fight this guy. I'll fight this guy.
didn't have his own armor. But, came to the fight, came to the gunfight with a knife, so to speak, right?
Exactly. So he's not trained, doesn't have armor, is really underprepared from a warrior standpoint. He's the youngest of his brothers who are serving in the military, they aren't the ones wanting to go out and fight, right? David comes out, think about the size difference too. I know we talk about this a lot, but I mean, there's like, in my head, right? So Goliath is like over 9 foot tall, right? So this tall dude, and David's probably, I can't remember off the top, he's like 5 foot something. There's a good chance there's a 3 to 4 foot height difference between David and Goliath. So real small dude, no military training, doesn't have armor, no weapons. He comes out and he's willing to fight. And why is he willing to fight? God. Trusting God. He knew what Saul should have known. He knew what Jonathan demonstrated back in chapter 14. He knew that if they just put their faith in God, that they would prevail. And so he wasn't worried, he wasn't scared. I can't imagine him not being somewhat intimidated, but it doesn't seem to be the case. I can't imagine not being like walking out on the field, this dude towering over me like by 3 or 4 feet, and he comes out and he's just ready to fight. How do you envision that slingshot that he uses? This is something I saw a video of somebody demonstrating how these are used. When growing up, I think slingshot. He's got his little sticks and stone shooting stuff. It's some sort of long, almost. I don't know exactly what it's made out of, but it's a long piece of flexible material. He locks that stone in, not a little pebble. I mean, it's a good sized stone, and he slings it around, and I mean, it whips out of that sling, and it's traveling at a high velocity. The video I saw was just it's just doing like target practice with it, super precise. He hits on this target, makes loud pop, just very significant weapon. Seems to be, right. So it's always been it's growing up kind of hard to imagine how's that sling take them down. But if you ever go look up like the type of sling that was used, you can watch a video and it's like makes a lot more sense how that worked. But even to imagine that David is able to utilize that with such precision that it comes, boom, strikes him in his forehead and takes him out.
So, he picked up the stones they were natural stones. Now, so 5 best looking stones, I guess you could find at a stream bed. But if you do Google that, you'll, when I was doing that class on David and Psalms, I did look at some of that, and there's a lot of archaeological findings of these stones, the sling stones, and they were made out of like cut limestone, so they're perfectly round. Yeah. And there's like hundreds of them that have been found, and they're about that size. They're not like I say, they're not like pebbles or marbles, like they're big stones, and they whip those babies. But they were the ones that are manufactured are like literally still perfectly round. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really interesting weapon choice, but really effective apparently.
They can also sling him pretty far distance. We're not talking about he's from me to you.
Sure.
There's a battlefield here that he's having to launch this across. And he's doing it with, like you say, accuracy, precision.
Yeah.
Enough to incapacitate him, enough to grab the sword.
Yeah. So they're close enough that they can hear each other holler at each other, far enough away that Goliath isn't going to get a blow in. At the end of the story, what does David take from Goliath? His head,
His
armor, and his sword. What does David do with his sword?
Later give it to the priest, gets it back.
We're going to see this sword. He talks about taking it to his tent here at the end of chapter 17. And we're going to read about this sword coming back up here in a few chapters. So interesting that David has no armor. When he goes into this battle, he comes out with the sword of Goliath. And that's going to become his weapon as he flees Saul in these coming chapters. So as we move into chapter 18 through 2 Samuel 1, what things stood out to you as significant? What things might you have comments or questions about from your reading this week?
think it's interesting to see. There was a long time in my life where I kind of pictured David as like a young teenager, maybe something like that. That he kills Goliath, and then we see that chapter 18 is going out and slaying thousands of people, leading armies and so forth on the headship of Saul. And so that's how this saying is Saul is slain his thousands and David's 10,000s. Idea is just that he was a man for this man that trusted in God, obviously, but he was a man that was very successful in battle, and not just with Goliath, but with other nations.
So in verse 5 of chapter 18, we see that Saul sets David over the men of war. So David is in effect here the captain of the army. He's going out wherever Saul sends him, and he finds success. As you move through those next handful of verses, we get to verse 7. He's had this great success, and then we see the women coming, singing, and dancing. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000. Saul finds this to be insulting. It's hard to judge the intentions of what these women were trying to say. But I did some reading on it. There's some indication when you think about the comparison of thousands to 10,000s. It's not so much Saul's only killed, in the thousands. David's actually killed in the 10,000s. Let's look at just a couple of verses. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 32, verse 30. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 30, we're in the Song of Moses at the end of his life. He says, "How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock has sold them and the Lord had surrendered them?" If you look in Psalm 91. Psalm chapter 91, verse 7. The psalmist says, 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you. If you look in Micah chapter 6. Micah chapter 6, verse 7. This is the Lord talking here. He's pleading with Israel. He says, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? We look at this phrasing of thousands and 10,000s. It seems to be just a pairing of words and ideas that's used in poetry, and we see it time and time again. So the Song of Moses, we see it in the psalmist writing, we see it in Micah. You see it several times used. It's a word pair that's being used, not necessarily as a comparison of the in our case here in 1 Samuel 18, it's not necessarily a comparison of Saul to David. Really, there's some suggest that this may have been even intended to be a praise for Saul. Saul, you've slain your thousands. Now you've made this guy captain over your army, and he's slaying tens of thousands. So it's just interesting. I always read that as almost they're trying to take a jab at Saul and say, David's better than you. And maybe there is some foreshadowing of that. At this point, Saul's been told the kingdom's gonna be taken from him. But really, not necessarily that these women were trying to put Saul down, but regardless of their intent, how did Saul take that? Or poorly. So he makes David the captain of his army. David is successful, and it makes Saul feel small, insignificant. He's insulted by this. And that leads to the narrative of like the rest of the story here that we went through this week. Saul starts this quest to harm David. As you read through, what kind of stands out to you as significant about Saul's ongoing plot against David?
I think it's interesting how it kind of gradually progresses, you know, you read this, he became angry and he started eyeing it, and he became jealous, and then just like you slowly see this kind of creep and grab hold of him to the point where then he tries to murder him.
Twice.
Yeah.
In a row, it seems. So if we look at Saul in chapter 18, just a few verses later, in verse 11, talks about David escaping the spear of Saul twice. What does that say about David?
A little slow on the uptake, maybe.
It could be a couple of things, you know, maybe he's not quite like, is he really trying to kill me? Like, maybe not. Let's go back, try this again. Maybe he remained to reason with Saul. Let's have a conversation, like, what's going on? Maybe it seems to be that David has helped him through this distressing spirit in the past. Maybe he thought this was just something that he could help Saul overcome. Either way, David doesn't flee Saul yet.
Well, after Saul is dead and David laments his death, I think we kind of get a glimpse about David's attitude towards Saul, that he obviously views Saul as God's anointed. He views himself in subjection to Saul, even though Saul's trying to kill him. And to me, David stands out as just such a remarkable character of devotion to the one that God appoints to lead, regardless of how that man behaves, regardless of how disloyal that person is to David, even though David's completely loyal to Saul. You know, there's a lot about David's response to Saul that teaches us a lot of lessons about thinking properly, even about whether it's about governing authorities or whether it's about leaders in the church or even within the family. You know, how do we treat each other, and how do we respect the leadership structure that God has set forth?
Yeah, so last week we kind of talked a little more in themes about some of the themes that we see in these chapters, and leadership is a big theme. Obviously, we're talking about a change in the leadership structure in the nation. David doesn't teach us just about leadership, he teaches about following leadership. Lots of lessons from David and his attitude towards Saul, certainly. Why do you think David stayed so close to Saul? Obviously, he understands that he's God's anointed, he's going to follow the God-appointed king. Those things are certainly true, but what other reasons did David choose to remain close?
Daughter, best friend with Jonathan.
So he's very much intermingled with the family. So at the beginning of chapter 18, we see that he and Jonathan are close friends. It says, now when he had finished speaking to Saul, as David finishes speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. So they have a special relationship. So much so that Jonathan loves David as he loves himself. There's maybe some lesson there as we go into New Testament, and it talks about husbands' loves for wives and things like that. But even here, we're going to read later that the love that Jonathan and David had for one another was greater than that of the love they had for. I can't remember the wording off the top of my head. We'll get to it in the later chapters, but the love that they shared with women, and it had to do with this special bond of friendship that they shared. Then we get to the end of chapter 18, and Saul has this plot that he's going to give his daughter to David to be his wife. He offers his oldest daughter or older daughter. And how does David respond initially to this one?
Amazing ability. Who am I to become king's son?
So Saul says, David, become the king's son-in-law. Take my daughter as your wife. David says, I'm not worthy. We're not in the same social status. This would not make sense. I can't do that. Of course, I think we see Saul's underlying intention here is not because he wants David as a son-in-law. He wants to kind of bring David in, hold his enemy close, and hopefully he talks to him about being a valiant warrior. Seems if you're this valiant warrior, I'm going to give you my daughter. I think the idea is that maybe he's going to die in battle, and then all of this is resolved. But then when David refuses, Saul gives away his older daughter, and then he offers Michal. What was different from the older daughter to Michal? Michal loved David. So we now have the love of Michal talked about. That's not talked about with the older daughter. So David has Jonathan, close friend, best friend, and now Saul's daughter says she loves David. How does David respond?
Initially the same way.
Exactly. It's still not about he seems to share this love with Michal, but it says same sort of thing. I'm not worthy to be the king's son-in-law. I thought it was interesting as he goes forward, Saul says, okay, well, here's what I would require of you, right? You go to the Philistine, 100 foreskins of the Philistines is the dowry. He says in verse 25. So David goes that day, realizes he can do this, like, okay, yeah, that's something I can do. That's something that will make it happen. Verse 27, 200. David goes out and slays 200 Philistines, pays twice the dowry, and walks away with Michal at the end of the day. I thought that was just an interesting story. There's 100. David's not worthy. Saul asks for vengeance on his enemies. Bring to me 100 foreskin of the Philistines. And David goes out and says, I'll do you one better. Here's 200. Just interesting story there. We read at the very end of chapter 18. David's name becomes highly esteemed. Through the story, and we'll see this time and time again, David's reputation is bolstered. David's reputation is proven. David maintains a good reputation among the people. And that just festers within Saul. Like David, there's a lot of foreshadowing that we see that David is going to be the successor. And I think Saul's recognizing this early, whether he truly believes that David's going to be king after him or not. It's clearly bothering him that David has such good favor with the people. As we move forward here, we spent some time in chapter 18. I don't want to get too bogged down in many of these chapters. What else stands out to you as we go forward in the reading through the week?
It's interesting just how David is reacting to all of Saul's threats, and even like when Saul is trying to give him Michal, like David has no intention of trying to undermine Saul or steal his throne. So it's just interesting that Saul almost has like a realization that this is God, like God had already told him he had taken away the kingdom, and it's like he could kind of see the direction God was probably going with David. And even if he couldn't, it's just interesting how David gave him no reason to hate him. David, even when he's fleeing from him later and has the opportunity to kill him, he just takes a piece of his robe and then says, he even regrets that, but he says, Saul, like, look, I could have killed you. And I would not do that to God's anointed, and Saul feels like penitent in that moment, but it's just interesting how David never gave him a reason, but because of Saul's own insecurity and his own realization that God has left him and moved on to David, that he like continued to hate David, even though throughout all of this, no matter what Saul did, like you just said, like David's reputation continues to be highly esteemed and lifted up despite what Saul does. So it's interesting to also see God's plan through it and how Saul really gonna undermine God.
So look in, this is back in chapter 18, but look in chapter 18, verse 12. It says, now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So we see that. And then we go to verse 28. We have this story with Michal, and at the end of that story, it says, thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So verse 12 to me stands out as a verse where it's more of a statement to the reader that the Lord was with David and that he had departed from Saul. And then as David's character is tested and proven, Saul becomes aware of the truth that's talked about in verse 12. Saul now recognizes that the Lord is with David. It's the Lord that's with David. And that's going to drive a lot of his motivation going forward. What's interesting to me about that is Saul recognizes the Lord is with David, that the Lord is not with him. But rather than fixing that, trying to fix his relationship with the Lord, it just turns to hate to David. Reminds me of Cain and Abel. Abel's offerings pleasing to God. That makes Cain jealous, rather than doing what he needed to do to fix the offering that he had given. It creates that envy and strife between him and Abel, that he's going to go kill Abel. Very similar here. Saul knows he's out of favor with the Lord, that David has the favor of the Lord, that the Lord is with him, but Saul just wants him dead. So he's going to persecute David, and we're going to read that in chapter 19 and going forward. What else stands out?
I feel like from Saul's perspective, two of his children now, it talks about them having a love for David, and two of them essentially go against Saul's wishes to have David dead and help them escape from him. And it's almost, I feel like in Saul's perspective, it seems like it's not just the Lord that's turned away from him, his own children now have kind of taken David have more favor with David than with them, so that almost kind of festers the anger that he has towards them too.
So in verse 28, we see Saul recognizes that Michal truly loves David. And as we get to chapter 19, we see the loyalty of Jonathan for David. What's ironic about Jonathan, specifically Jonathan, being so loyal to David? Jonathan, based on family, right? Birthright.
He was the next in line.
Next in line. And we see Jonathan's character time and time again. Jonathan's not concerned about the throne. He's not concerned about being king. He's concerned about justice and doing what's right. And what's right is protecting David. And so Jonathan, goes to bat for David several times before Saul. So much so that what does Saul ultimately do to Jonathan?
Let's kill him.
Let's kill him. So Saul apparently needed his spears taken away, because every time he had one, he's throwing them at people, the people closest to him. And we kind of see in Saul, and I think we talked about this a little bit last week too, but we see Saul following the same pattern of rebellion the Israelite people as a whole were following in the period of the Judges. They depart from the Lord, they come back. They depart a little further, they come back. We're getting to the point with Saul that he's departed so far that he never really comes back. There's a few instances where we see John or Saul say offer words of repentance, maybe, but we never really see his behavior truly change as we go through these stories. As you get to chapter 21, this story is significant. We have the story of David and the holy bread. This is significant because we talk about this where else in the Bible?
From the New Testament, given as a logical excuse for Jesus talking about this. I think it's the Sabbath day, or his reasoning for why he did something, and the Pharisees are condemning.
Yeah, so they're condemning him, and Jesus brings this story up, saying, "Wait, you're condemning us for what we're doing, but we're all okay over here with David." Back in this story we have in 1 Samuel 21, in this story of David eating the holy bread that's in the temple for the priests, he takes that wasn't for him, that wasn't right, but we're okay with that, and we're splitting hairs over what's happening here with us. So Jesus points back to this story. So as we work through the story of David and the holy bread here, what's going on?
Fleeing. Let him away. Kind of created the story and ends up and asks for bread, and bread, showbread, priest would use, so that's what he ends up gives to his.
So he's fleeing from Saul. David conjures this story. We're gonna you can make some assumptions as to why David doesn't just tell him the truth of what's going on. Maybe the suggestion that the one I like to go with, I guess, because it seems most consistent with David's character, is it almost seems that David is wanting to protect him, give him the ability to claim ignorance if Saul should come question him for helping David. He doesn't want to give away the fact that he's running from Saul, that he could appear to be aiding the fugitive here. So maybe there's some motivation discussion there, but the priest here, Ahimelech, he agrees to give David and his men the showbread on a condition. What was that condition?
He would no, did not have any sort of association with women for the past 3 days, and pure.
So he points to them not having been with a woman. This goes back to the law of Moses and their cleanness. It seems that the priest here starts to kind of make some concession. Well, if these people are clean, then this will be all right. The point of this story, I don't think, is to say what's right or wrong on if they should or should not have had the bread. But we see that there is David lying in this story, that the priest is departing from the pattern that God has given them for the use of the bread, giving it to David. But David takes it, and David goes on, and he flees to Gath in the remainder of chapter 21. I thought it was interesting in this story that these people knew of David, they knew of his reputation. They even referred to him as the king. They likely didn't know that he had actually been appointed by God to be the next king. But we see this causes fear within David, and how does David react to all this knowledge that they have of him?
Perception. He pretends to be insane.
So deception. So he puts on this persona of the madman so that they'll leave him alone. This kind of stood out to me a little bit as interesting. So we have David's reputation of being a mighty warrior. They know this reputation. We think back to the story of David and Goliath. David goes to battle with Goliath because he acknowledges that the Lord is with him, and with the Lord on his side, he's going to be successful. This is one little almost blimp in David's record of like what happened to the faith that God was on his side and in control. Just is interesting story here. As you move on, chapter 22, he gathers his band of warriors together, all the people, his family, friends, people who had sided with them, people who didn't feel that they had another place in the kingdom because they were generally displeased with the current order of affairs. They come together, and how many men does David gather? 400. So 400 men versus the rest of the army of Israel. Would be significant. As you move through the next period of time here, what things stood out?
They almost think of it, it's almost like a Robin Hood story. You know, all the downtrodden, destitute, people who were distressed and dead, they all kind of flock to him out in the wilderness, and then he protects, winds up protecting Nabal's flocks and doing a variety of other things, but it just kind of it always felt like a biblical Robin Hood story to me.
Yeah, certainly does. Same thing I was thinking of as a straight in three, they're hiding in the forest and in the strongholds and these caves. They're just avoiding. That's the game they're playing, is avoidance. They're not looking for conflict. They're just avoiding, and then they're doing their part as protectors of the people, and he gains this little following here. What else? Move forward and even into the end here.
Well, I was just noting in chapter 22, what a difference there is between Saul and David. David has such a high regard for Saul as God's anointed, that he won't strike him, that Saul murders 400 priests, I think it was, 400. Anyway, he murders these priests of the Lord, and he even calls them the priests of the Lord, and he tells his guards in verse 17 of chapter 22, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hands with David. And so you just think about, it's 85 men, verse 18, that he killed. So he kills all these priests who are priests of the Lord just because of his fear of David. And it's Doeg, who's not even an Israelite, he's an Edomite, he's a servant, who is the one that informs Saul of David's whereabouts and the participation with him. So anyway, just so much intertwining there of the Edomites and the opposition that they had against Israel, and now it's Doeg, an Edomite, who guides Saul to this end. Saul's disregard for those who are servants of God. So many aspects of that are fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, this was such an interesting story because you see how far Saul has departed. He acknowledges that these are the priests of the Lord. He tells his men, kill them. And they're like, hold on. It's interesting that it's not another Israelite, another follower of Saul that says, this is a good idea. This is absolutely what we need to do. Let's start killing the priests. So we see just even that disconnect in leadership, that Saul doesn't even have the full submission of his army. due to his poor judgment at this point. So it takes an Edomite, somebody who's not from Israel, to come and do Saul's dirty work. Saul's pleased with that. It's really striking just to think about how far he's gone.
Interesting that Doeg Edomite's occupation. He's Saul's chief herdsman. And this kind of goes back to one of the contrasts we see between Saul and David. When we're introduced to Saul, he's an incompetent donkey wrangler. He's out searching for his father's donkeys. You know, and then in his kingdom, it's not even an Israelite who's the chief shepherd, whereas David is introduced as a shepherd. And even later in these chapters, you know, Saul still can't find anything. He's chasing around David, can't find him. At one point, Saul's chasing David, but Jonathan just goes over to him and doesn't seem to have any trouble finding him. So kind of we're introduced to why, another example of why David is more fit to be king than Saul is that David's, you know, competence as a shepherd and Saul's complete incompetence there.
Yeah, absolutely. As we think about some of those things, the story of Jonathan finding David was a little bit interesting to me as well. As you think about that, you know, Jonathan acknowledges in chapter 23 that David's going to be king. He's confident that David will be king. We see that David spares Saul's life for the first time we see in chapter 24. And then we have this brief little blurb in chapter 25, verse 1. One verse dedicated to the death of Samuel. So Samuel's been this influential character. And we get to chapter 25 and we just get the little bit, Samuel died. So you like, you know, stage exit left a long time ago. He's not really part of the story that we see coming back up for the last several chapters. And then this one verse, it's just Samuel's dead. And really, we see him having led the people through this transition from this theocracy where God is the leader of the people. They wanted a king. God gave them a king. And at this point in time, Saul's attitude is kind of just symbolic of what happens here. Saul sees himself as top dog. There's nobody above him anymore. And that coincides really in line with the fact that Samuel's not dead. The spokesperson for God is he's out of the picture. Now we'll see him come back up in a later story, but this transition is really complete here. We get to the story of David and the wife of Nabal. So we have the story of David with Abigail. Anything that y'all want to stop and talk about there with this story? We talked about this a little bit in the Judges a couple weeks ago when we talked about Deborah and Jael. God using a woman here again to in this instance to avoid well, David praises God at the end of the story that God intervenes for him and he protects him from doing evil, and God did this through Abigail. So just an interesting story there that God is using people in these stories, and sometimes it's the unlikely people or the people who otherwise would be looked at as unworthy for that type of role. God is using them. Women did not have high rank in these cultures and these societies. They weren't viewed in the same way as equal participants here. But Abigail stands up. We see her wisdom. She is very understanding of what is actually going on, of who her husband Nabal is. She acknowledges his character. She really kind of gives us a story on intercession. She's delivering the gifts, the payment, that Nabal should have delivered. And she saves, really what would likely have been a bloodbath here and a spot on David's record. All because of her wise actions. At the end of this story, though, we get this little note about Saul having given Michal to another man as wife. What's important about that? Or why do you think he did that?
Hoping that David never comes back. It's kind of a dig at him as well. It takes something that he'd given to David away and show his displeasure.
Yeah. So this is just in with our understanding of marriage today, it's hard to at least for me to grasp some of the concepts of what's going on in these marriages in the Old Testament and these polygamous relationships and David having a couple of wives, and now this wife that was David's wife, the daughter of Saul, is taken from David. If we go back to when Michal helps David escape, when she comes before Saul and Saul is questioning her about what happened, she lies about the situation. She talks about she kind of pins it all on David. She's the one who helped him escape. She seems to be the one who gave him the idea. So maybe there's some, she didn't desire to be married to David. Maybe it's just Saul taking a jab at David, like, don't come back, like there's nothing for you here. Just an interesting note. Again, some of these statements are just really brief statements of fact that I think play a somewhat significant role in the story. As we move to chapter 26, though, we see that David spares Saul a second time. So mentioned early on this point about David or Saul showing words of repentance. It seems to just be he's thankful to not be dead. And these are the things he should say to show that he's glad David didn't kill him. But we see his pattern continues as we go through the rest of this chapter or the rest of this book and into 2 Samuel 1. Anything else that stands out to you guys to kind of wrap up here, Matthew?
Interesting how David's reaction here in 26:19, starting in the second half, but if it is the children of men, inciting Saul against David, but if it is the children of men, may be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day from sharing in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. It seems like there's some despair going on there, and we do see him, leaving Judah. We don't see him serving other gods, but he does decide to leave Judah and start hanging out with the Philistines. And that seems to get him in all sorts of trouble, and he's having to set up a pretty elaborate deception so that the Philistines don't kill him, just like the last time he tried to go into the Philistines.
Sure. Anything else?
I love David's mindset in chapter 30 when his wives are captured and everybody else has bitterness in their soul, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And you just see David do that over and over again.
More often than not, when you see David in a distressing time, the text talks about David seeking the counsel of the Lord. Bring the ephod, where we're consulting God here. What should we do? How do we handle this? Time and time again, he does that. And it's just interesting that he strengthens himself in the Lord and then he consults the Lord. What shall we do? So David had some sort of internal peace because of his relationship with God, and that gave him the confidence to go to God and seek his counsel. Next week, we'll continue on in the story. If there's anything that we've missed through the last of 1 Samuel, we can address that, but we'll start in 2 Samuel next week.